Ladies and gentlemen, gather round, for we are about to dive into the tale of one of the most beautifully resolved character arcs in the world of Japanese anime. This is the story of a girl who began her life not with a battle cry, but with silence. This is the complete story and struggle of the flower-breathing user, the Suguko of the insect Hashira. Kanao Tsuyuri. Picture this, a dark, tragic backstory worthy of any shonen protagonist. A young Kanao, born into a home of such cruelty and neglect that she was treated as less than human. The light in her eyes faded, her voice fell silent, and her very will to choose was shattered. To cope, she surrendered her agency to the universe, making every decision, no matter how small, with the flip of a single coin. Can you imagine a life where you have no say, where fate is a 50-50 chance? It was a prison without bars, constructed from her own trauma. But then, like a sakura blossom drifting into a desolate field, entered the Kocho Sisters. Shinobu and the gentle Kanae. They didn't just rescue her, they offered her a home, a family, and a purpose. They were patient, they were kind, and they slowly, carefully, tried to show her that her own heart's voice was worth listening to. This was her first struggle, the struggle to simply feel worthy of love again. To truly understand the warrior Kanao Tsuyuri became, we must first journey into the profound darkness from which she was rescued. Our story begins not with clashing blades, but with a suffocating silence, in a world devoid of color and choice. Imagine a child, so young she should be cradled in the warmth of a family's love, but instead, she is treated as a mere object. Kanao's earliest memories are not of lullabies or playful games, but of a cold, unforgiving reality. She was born into a home that was less a sanctuary and more a prison. The people who should have been her protectors were her tormentors. They saw her not as a daughter, but as a burden, a piece of property to be abused and neglected. The light of innocence that shines in every child's eyes was systematically extinguished in hers, replaced by a hollow, vacant stare. This was a trauma so deep, so fundamental, that it didn't just scar her, it shattered the very core of her being. When a human being endures pain beyond their capacity, the mind, in a desperate bid to survive, builds walls. For Kanao, the wall she built was absolute. She retreated so far within herself that she ceased to speak. Her voice, that instrument of will and desire, fell silent. But the silence was only the external symptom, the internal wound was far more devastating. She lost her ability to choose. Think about that for a moment. Every day, from the moment we wake up, we are making choices. What to wear, what to eat, where to go, what to say. These choices, no matter how small, are the expressions of our will, the proof of our existence as autonomous individuals. For Kanao, this was stripped away. The constant abuse and rejection taught her a terrible lesson, that her choices were meaningless, that her will was irrelevant, and that the only way to avoid further pain was to stop trying altogether. To make a choice was to risk being wrong, to risk punishment, to risk the agony of failure. So, she stopped. In this void of will, she found a desperate, heartbreaking solution, a simple coin. This coin became her god, her commander, her entire moral and practical compass. When faced with any decision, should I eat this piece of bread? Should I take a step forward? Should I look up? She would flip the coin. Heads for yes, tails for no. She surrendered her agency completely to this random twist of metal in the air. It was a prison without bars, constructed from her own trauma, and she was both the inmate and the warden. This wasn't a quirk or a cute character trait, it was a profound psychological wound. The coin was her shield against a world that had hurt her too much. If the coin decided, then she couldn't be blamed. If fate led her astray, it wasn't her failure. She had found a way to navigate life without ever having to live, to move through the world without ever truly being present in it. She was a ghost in her own body, a puppet with a coin for strings. This is the foundational tragedy of Kanao Tsuyuri. Before she ever learned flower breathing, before she ever held a Nichiren blade, she was a girl who had been broken by the very people who should have nurtured her. Her struggle was not against demons with monstrous powers, but against the demon of her own past, a demon that whispered she was powerless, that her voice didn't matter, and that the safest path was to never, ever choose for herself. This deep, ingrained powerlessness is what makes her eventual triumph not just a victory of strength, but a monumental rebirth of the spirit. The stage was set for a miracle, for someone to see the fragile human being buried beneath the silence and the shining coin, and to offer a hand not of pity, but of genuine love. If the first act of Kanao's life was a portrait painted in the bleakest shades of gray, Then the arrival of Shinobu and Kanae Kocho was the moment vibrant color was daringly splashed onto the canvas. This was not a simple rescue, it was a slow, patient, and deliberate awakening. Imagine the scene from the perspective of a broken child. After a lifetime of existing as an object, of being met with harsh words and cruel hands, two figures appear who are unlike anything she has ever known. They did not burst in with loud proclamations. Kanae, the flower Hashira, with a warmth as gentle and pervasive as sunlight, and Shinobu, whose smile, though complex, offered a sanctuary she had never known. They didn't just open the door to her cage, they patiently dismantled it, piece by piece, over years. Their home at the Butterfly Mansion became more than just a building, it was a living, breathing ecosystem of healing. The air itself felt different, it was light, filled with the scent of wisteria and medicine, a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere of her past. The most radical thing the Kocho sisters offered was not shelter, food, or even training, it was unconditional positive regard. For a soul conditioned to expect punishment, this was utterly disorienting. They spoke to her in soft tones, not commands. They gave her a clean, beautiful uniform, not rags. They provided a bed of her own, a space that was hers and could not be violated. These were simple acts, but for Kanao, each one was a seismic event. Every kindness was a pebble dropped into the still, dark pond of her psyche, creating ripples that slowly eroded the walls she had built. Kanae, in particular, was the embodiment of maternal patience. She understood that Kanao's silence was not defiance, but a deep-seated fortress. She didn't demand that Kanao speak or choose. Instead, she would sit with her, talking about the flowers in the garden, the patterns of the clouds, the mission of the Demon Slayer Corps, not to elicit a response, but simply to fill the silence with the sound of a caring voice. She was teaching Kanao, through relentless repetition, that it was safe to listen, that a voice could be a source of comfort, not pain. She was rewiring Kanao's most fundamental associations with human interaction. Shinobu's role was different but equally vital. While Kanae was the gentle sun, Shinobu was the pragmatic, protective moon. Her approach was one of sharp intellect and unwavering resolve. She saw Kanao's potential not just as a survivor, but as a warrior. She began to train her, not with the harsh drills of a taskmaster, but with the precise guidance of a master craftsman shaping a precious material. In the controlled movements of swordsmanship, in the rhythmic patterns of breathing styles, Kanao found a new kind of language. It was a language without words, where her body could express power, grace, and purpose without her voice ever needing to be involved. The dance of combat became her first form of self-expression. This was the blossoming of a new family. It was a bond forged not by blood, but by chosen compassion. The sisters became her new frame of reference, her normal. They were living proof that strength could be gentle, that a smile could be genuine, and that the world contained pockets of profound safety. They didn't try to snatch the coin from her hand, they understood it was her crutch, and to force her to let go would only cause her to fall. Instead, they focused on strengthening the leg so that one day, she might not need the crutch at all. They were building a foundation so solid that when the time came for Kanao to stand on her own, she would not crumble. This chapter of her life was a quiet, ongoing struggle, the struggle between the old, terrifying world of compliance and the new, bewildering world of agency. The Kocho sisters were the gardeners who tenderly cared for a dormant seed, providing just enough water, sunlight, and protection, trusting that one day, it would find the strength to break through the soil and reach for the sun on its own. The foundation built by the Kocho sisters was sturdy, but the house of Kanao's soul remained quiet and largely empty. She had safety, she had purpose, but the core engine of her own will was still dormant. It would take a force of nature unlike any other to jump-start that engine, a boy whose very existence was a testament to the power of an indomitable human spirit. Enter Tanjiro Kamado. To Kanao, whose entire world was built on a framework of logic, duty, and the cold randomness of a coin, Tanjiro must have seemed like a bewildering phenomenon. He was a living storm of raw emotion, unwavering conviction, and radical kindness. Where others saw a demon, he saw a lost sibling worthy of grief. Where others saw an enemy, he saw a tragedy. His compassion was not calculated or conditional, it was as instinctive and relentless as his water-breathing techniques. Their early interactions were a study in contrasts. When Tanjiro, battered and broken after his first encounter with the upper ranks, lay recuperating at the Butterfly Mansion, he saw Kanao's coin-flipping not as a curious habit, but as a cry for help. He didn't just observe her, he spoke directly to the person trapped inside. His question, "Can't you decide things on your own?" wasn't an accusation. It was filled with a genuine, heartbreaking concern that bypassed all her defenses. For someone who had been ignored and dehumanized, to be seen so clearly was terrifying. It was the first crack in the dam. Tanjiro became her living reference point for what it meant to have a will. He was a walking, fighting, bleeding example of someone who chose, every single second, to follow his heart. He chose to be kind to a demon sister. He chose to fight impossible battles for his friends. He chose to get back up when every bone in his body screamed for him to stay down. Kanao, the master observer, watched this. She witnessed his struggles during recovery training, not with pity, but with a dawning sense of awe. Here was someone who faced pain and uncertainty not by flipping a coin, but by gritting his teeth and pushing forward with everything he had. He was the catalyst that made her internal struggle acute. The safe, passive world of chance that the coin provided began to feel insufficient. It was a cage that now felt cramped. Tanjiro's existence posed a revolutionary question to her very soul: what if I could be like that? What if I, too, could feel so strongly about something that I would fight for it, not because a coin told me to, but because my own heart demanded it? He didn't give her the answers. He didn't need to. By simply being himself, he gave her the one thing the coin never could: a vision of a different way to live. He became the reason she started to want to choose, to want to feel, to want to fight for her own desires. He was the spark that landed on the kindling the Kocho sisters had so carefully gathered, and it began to smolder, waiting for the moment it would finally burst into flame. Every great character arc demands a climax where the internal struggle becomes an external battle. For Kanao Tsuyuri, that moment arrived in the frozen, lethal palace of Upper Moon 2, Doma. This was not merely a fight for survival, it was the final, violent stage of her war for selfhood. All the lessons, all the kindness, and all the sparks of inspiration led to this single, defining crucible. Confronted by a demon who was the very embodiment of emotional emptiness, a monster who consumed human feeling as sustenance, Kanao faced the ultimate test of her will. Doma, with his hollow smile and chilling apathy, was the antithesis of everything Tanjiro and the Kocho sisters represented. He was a void that threatened to swallow the fragile self she was still learning to possess. The situation was dire. Her partner Inosuke was gravely injured, and the fate of her mission, and her very soul, hung in the balance. In this moment of supreme pressure, her oldest coping mechanism re-emerged. The coin. Her fingers, moving by a lifetime of habit, sent it spinning into the air one last time. It was a reflex, a desperate reach for the cold, familiar comfort of fate over the terrifying uncertainty of choice. The coin landed on retreat. And in that heartbeat, the entire narrative of Kanao's life converged. The memory of Kanae's gentle voice, the image of Shinobu's determined smile, and the roaring, unwavering spirit of Tanjiro Kamado, all of them were a chorus shouting down the silent command of the coin. They were the living proof that willpower was real, that love was a force stronger than fear, and that some paths must be chosen, not randomly assigned. The coin's advice was logical, it was safe, but it was a lie. It was the lie her trauma had created, and in that moment, she saw it for what it was, a prison. With a resolve that echoed through the very foundations of her being, she made the most powerful decision of her life. She crushed the coin in her hand. This was not an act of anger, but of liberation. It was the physical, visceral rejection of her past and the triumphant embrace of her future. In that single, glorious moment, the puppet severed her own strings. The girl who could not choose was gone, and the woman who would defy fate itself stood in her place. What followed was not just a sword technique, but the pure, unadulterated manifestation of her own will. The final form, Equinoctial Vermilion Eye, was more than a combat form, it was her soul set ablaze, a technique powered not by obligation or chance, but by her own burning desire to protect, to avenge, and to live. She had finally found a reason to fight that was entirely her own, and in doing so, she completed the journey from a girl guided by a flip of a coin to a warrior steered by the unshakable compass of her own heart.